The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this NQA webinar on ISO 9001 2015 Essentials. My name is Margaret Rooney. I'm a regional assessor, and I've also been very active in helping prepare ourselves for the 2015 standards. This presentation is being recorded, so you will have the opportunity to listen to it again at a later date, and we'll send you details of that, and we'll also send you copies of the slides. If during this webinar you have any specific questions that you'd like to ask, please type them into the box on the right-hand side of your screen, the chat box. So if you have any questions, comments, observations, please do avail yourselves of that, and you can do that during the presentation. You don't have to wait till the end. I'll be speaking for approximately 45 minutes, or with a bit of luck, maybe less than that, and we've allowed time at the end to address the questions and issues that you may raise. So today we're looking at 9001 2015, and we're looking specifically at the 9001 standard, and the objectives are to give you knowledge and understanding of the significant changes to the standard, an understanding of the new requirements, and an overall summary of the key changes and themes. That's what we'll do as something of a wrap-up at the end of the presentation. Now, I'm sure you're all aware that 9001 2015 and all management system standards from here on will be developed around what's called the Annex SL structure. Now, this in fact was the subject of a separate webinar, and I'm sure many of you have already attended this. So just to very briefly refresh our memories, we have the 10 clauses of the Annex SL high-level structure: scope, normative references, terms and definitions, and then we have context of the organization, leadership, planning, support, operation, performance evaluation and improvement. And those clause headings are the same whatever management system standard we happen to be looking at. And the reason that the 7 clauses, 4 to 10, are in blue is that these are the auditable sections of the management system standard, and it's these clauses that we'll be looking at in a bit more detail for ISO 9001. Looking at the 2015 standard, there are 3 elements to consider. It's adopted, 9001 has now adopted the Annex SL framework, which, as I've indicated, gives us the high-level structure, identical core text, and common terms and definitions for all management system standards. And indeed, 30% of the 2015 standard is taken up, shall we say, by Annex SL. That's not my information. The source of that is the Chartered Quality Institute, which has done some analysis around the effect of Annex SL on the standards. The 2015 standard does still contain a significant amount of the 2008 text. And then there are some additional changes specific to 9001 that are now in the 2015 version of the standard, and we'll be looking at those during this presentation. So I'm going to do a clause-by-clause review of the 9001 changes. This is not going to be very detailed. You'll be relieved to know you can read the standard, but I'll just try and highlight some of the important things to note. Starting then with the first auditable clause, Clause 4, context of the organisation. What I'm doing here, I'm setting out on the left-hand side the Annex SL clauses, and on the right-hand side the equivalent 9001 clause and any differences or additions that there may be. Now, in fact, when we look at context of the organisation, clause 4, not surprisingly, we have exactly that same clause in 9001. Understanding the organisation and its context is really reproduced as is from Annex SL. So we're still in an area of generic management system requirements within this clause 4. Understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties, that again is a direct requirement also of the ISO 9001:2015 standard. And determining the scope of the management system, not surprisingly, when we come to look at the 9001 requirements, we are determining the scope of our quality management system. And then finally, the requirements of the management system itself. And in 9001, we have a clause called Quality Management System and its processes. So it's not terribly different from the Annex SL requirements, except that we're seeing now the first hint, if you like, of the significance that 9001 now attaches to processes and the process-based approach. So in general terms, this clause 4 context, which is all about where does the organisation sit in the world, what are the influences for that business, who are the interested parties, all of these things are going to have an important impact on the management system. And these requirements are really quite generic and don't really differ too much across the management system standard. So a lot of Annex SL in this clause 4. So what do we have in this clause that is specific to 9001:2015? Well, clearly it references that it's a quality management system, and as I've already mentioned, it has a detailed section on processes. How does the requirement around context change from 2008? What's changed now? So on the right-hand side, I'm looking at what's changed from 2008. On the left-hand side, we're looking at items that are specific to the 2015 9001 standard over and above Annex SL. So what's different from 2008? Well, we have these requirements, context and interested parties, and these are new. We don't have these terms in 2008. Within the scope requirement in 4.3, the reference to exclusions has been removed. Certainly the term exclusions is no longer used, although there is an allowance made that if any of the system requirements, any of the standard requirements are not relevant to your organisation, in other words, they don't impact the quality of your product or service, you can indeed exclude them, but it's simply the terminology that's not there. And we have in 4.4, the quality management system and its processes, we have an elevated focus on processes here, both here and throughout the standard. Moving now to clause 5, leadership. Again, all these major clause headings are lifted directly from Annex SL, and the emphasis is on leadership, not just on management. So top management or the leaders need to have a greater involvement in the management system, or perhaps more correctly, need to be seen to have a greater involvement in the management system, because many leaders already are very actively involved, very actively driving the management system. It's not always the case, and 2015 is saying it needs to be the case from now on. The requirements of the management system must be integrated into the overall business processes. Again, many organizations are already doing this quite successfully. In other instances, it's fair to say the system is more of a bolt-on. Again, that will need to change. And the policy and objectives need to be compatible with the context and strategic direction of the organization. So we're getting an indication here that management system standards, management systems are very much more about addressing the business needs and integrating with the business. So again, we have our Annex SL requirements, and on the right-hand side, the specific 9001 requirements. And we have a requirement for leadership and commitment, and again we have that same requirement in 9001 because the requirements around leadership and commitment really are quite generic, whatever management system you're looking at. However, within 9001 we do have some subheadings, and this is allowed within the specific sector standards to introduce further subheadings. And we see straight away the requirement 5.1.2 for customer focus. That is unique or specific to 9001, this customer focus. Then we have the requirements around the need for a policy, and again this is a generic requirement that we have in 9001, although we have again some subheadings that 9001 uses, and these, in this case, these are really editorial, these subheadings, just to make the requirements around policy a little clearer. Then we have organizational roles, responsibilities and authorities, again a generic requirement of management systems, and that carries over directly into 9001. So again, in leadership we are seeing largely generic management system requirements which feature largely in 9001. So items specific to the 2015 standard, the additional subheadings that we see in that Clause 5 leadership, they are generally editorial. So it's just 9001 setting out the information perhaps a little more clearly. The emphasis on process approach and customer focus is additional to Annex SL. So this is specific to 9001. What's changed from the 2008 standard? Well, the emphasis on leadership and the engagement of leaders in the management system, that's a change from 2001. In fact, 2008. 2008, in fact, does not use the term leadership. And the requirements around the policy, in this case the quality policy, the requirements around this have been enhanced, particularly again in relation to leaders' involvement in driving the policy, developing the policy, communicating the policy. The policy must apply across the organisation, and it must be available as documented information. And we're seeing here some new terminology that we don't find in the 2008 standard, but we do find in Annex SL and in future management system standards, the term documented information. Then in organisational roles, responsibilities and authorities, what's changed from 2008? Well, there's no mention of a management representative. So that explicit 2008 requirement to have a management representative, that has been removed. However, what has not been removed are the responsibilities, the tasks that such a person would have normally carried out. They still need to be carried out, and the leaders of the organisation need to ensure that those things are still happening. Moving on now to the planning clause of both Annex SL and 9001. We have 6.1, actions to address risks and opportunities, and indeed this is a generic requirement and it's reproduced in 9001. Then we have objectives and planning to achieve them, and not surprisingly in 9001 we also have requirements for objectives and planning to achieve them, but in this case they are quality objectives. And then in fact we have in 9001 an additional clause, 6.3, planning of changes. This does not appear in other management system standards, so this is specific, unique to 9001. And these are changes to the management system itself. We need to plan for those changes, so the planning of changes to the management system itself. So just to reinforce that, on this next slide we have, what do we have that is specific to the 2015 version of 9001, the addition of planning of changes. And this, I think, emphasises the importance that the quality profession places on change. Throughout the standard there are a number of references to change and the need to record change properly and manage change effectively. And I think as quality professionals we are all painfully aware of the problems that poor control of change can cause. So that's why the standard puts a lot of emphasis on that. What's changed from the 2008 standard in relation to planning? Well, the requirement for actions to address risks and opportunities is in fact a new requirement. You won't find an explicit reference to this in the 2008 standard. Quality objectives and planning to achieve them, well, we do currently in 2008 have a requirement to have quality objectives. However, I think it's fair to say there is greater emphasis on objectives in the 2015 standard, and certainly an enhanced emphasis on the need to plan carefully how you are going to achieve those objectives. So that's an important change from 2008. And as I've already mentioned, we have this additional requirement, 6.3, which brings us an enhanced emphasis on planning of system changes. Again, I don't think 2008 really places much or any emphasis on the planning of system changes. So this is really emphasizing that the management system is a very important part of the overall business and the overall business processes, and anything that changes within that business, including the management system, needs to be carefully managed, carefully controlled. Clause 7, support. Again, looking at our Annex SL generic management system requirements around this, we have a need for resources, and we have that same need in 9001, not surprisingly. However, within 9001 we now have some additional requirements over and above Annex SL. We have these sub-clauses detailed there. So we have general requirements, we have requirements for people, infrastructure, environment for the operation of processes, monitoring and measuring resources, and organizational knowledge. So these sub-requirements, these additional requirements, are specific to 9001 itself, again demonstrating the importance that the quality profession has placed on these issues. Then we have the generic requirements around competence, awareness and communication, and we have those same generic requirements in 9001. So really not much difference between what Annex SL requires and what 9001 requires in these support sub-clauses. And then an area that we're very familiar with, although the terminology is slightly different, documented information, and not surprisingly, we have that requirement, that generic requirement that we're all very familiar with, that carries over into 9001. So what do we have in the support clause that is specific to 9001 over and above the Annex SL? Well, the resources subclause, as we've already seen, is very detailed compared to Annex SL, and just showing you again those 5 additional subclauses considered important enough to be added to the support clause in 9001, considered important enough by the quality profession for those requirements to go in. What's changed in support from the 2008 standard? Well, we now have emphasis on external and internal resources. Again, it's making explicit that when we think of resources, there are external as well as internal resources. That emphasis doesn't exist in 2008. Examples of infrastructure are cited now in the 2015 standard. I say examples because there is a note in this 7.1.3, but it's making suggestions. It's not a requirement, but the note suggests you might need to consider buildings, for example, utilities, equipment, transport, information technology. These are all examples of infrastructure that might be relevant. And again, in 7.1.4, we have more guidance for environment. That's environment for the operation of processes. And again, we have this guidance is in the form of a note, not a requirement. So it looks at, for example, human and physical factors, what sort of culture are we looking at, the physical factors, temperature, humidity, light, for example. So these are helpful notes incorporated in the 2015 standard. And it's largely covering the requirements. This clause 7 is largely covering the 2008 requirements of clauses 6 and 7.3. from the 2008 standard. And 7.1.6, organizational knowledge. This is both a new requirement since 2008, but it's also an additional requirement over and above Annex SL. So this is the quality profession acknowledging, recognizing, emphasizing the importance of organizational knowledge. And again, further changes since 2008. Requirements around 7.1, 7.2 and 7.3, those are the requirements for competence and awareness. They're equivalent to Clause 6.2 in the 2008 version, but the requirements have been extended to include outsourced personnel. So again, in general, 2015 brings a lot more emphasis on the external influences to our management system, as well as the internal issues. So everyone, internal and outsourced, must be aware of the policy and objectives. So any reference to external provision, outsourcing, this is what we traditionally thought of as purchased product. The requirements around communication are perhaps more prescriptive in the 2015 standard, and again we have this reference to external communications. So it's clearly spelled out in that clause in the standard. We need to think about what, when, with whom we're going to communicate, how that communication will take place, and very importantly, who is going to be responsible for that communication. So it's not that these are enormous shifts from 2008, it's more that the requirements have been enhanced, have been made more explicit in the 2015 standard. And then looking at clause 7.5, now called documented information, there's no mention of manual procedures or records. Those terms don't appear. That's not to say you cannot have those. You just won't find them described in that way in the standard. I suspect most of you listening do have a manual, you do have procedures, you do have records. That is what you call them. Carry on doing that. They're also generically known as documented information. Now we move to clause 8, operation. Now you might be thinking that so far I've referenced Annex SL a lot and indicated that a significant amount of the requirements that we've looked at are addressed through Annex SL, and yet I said early on that 30% of the standard was Annex SL. Well, the reason is that when we come to clause 8, operation, this is where 9001 has incorporated a significant amount of additional information that the quality profession uses. So it's really in clause 8 that we get a significant difference or a significant enhancement over and above the Annex SL basic requirements. So it's a very short clause in Annex SL. It's a short clause 8.1. but it's massive in 9001 2015. Now, I'm not going to go through this clause in great detail, actually largely because the content will be very familiar to you. And when I also mentioned that we have a lot of content that's still significantly similar to 2008, you would largely find that, or you'd find a lot of it in this clause 8. So we have the Annex SL operational planning and control, and that's reproduced in 9001. Then in the blue text here we have the 9001 requirements in this area over and above Annex SL. And as you'll shortly see, the quality profession has quite gone to town on ensuring that the standard incorporates its specific requirements. So looking at requirements for products and services, we need to consider, not surprisingly, our customer communication. We need to determine the requirements, nothing new there. We need to review those requirements, and we need to consider any changes to the requirements that might come about and how we're going to manage those. Then we have clause 8.3, design and development of products and services. If you do design, then clearly this is going to be important for you. And again, it's not that terribly different from the existing design requirements. We have then the sub-clauses, general requirements around design, design and development planning, inputs, controls, outputs, and again our old friend change, the management of change. That particular clause, clause 8.3, is actually a very nice illustration of the process approach. And I think it's the clearest illustration that there is in the 9001 standard. So even if you don't do design, I do recommend you read this clause carefully, because I do feel it sets out very nicely the process approach. The process approach needs to be planned, it needs inputs, it needs to be controlled, process itself, then we have the outputs and the management of changes. So a nice illustration of the process approach there. Then we have control of externally provided processes, products and services. Again, what we used to think of, or still do think of, as our purchased products and services. So there are general requirements, type and extent of control needed. That's another way of expressing risk. The extent of control will depend on the implications of things going wrong if we don't exercise that control. We need to think about what information we need to provide for our external providers. Then the general requirements around our product and service provision. How do we control that? Identification and traceability. I would suggest this is very familiar territory to us all. Property belonging to customers or external providers. Well, we're familiar with the requirement, I would suggest, for customer-owned owned property, but the 2015 standard reminds us that our external providers, there may be some implications there that we need to consider their property. Preservation, again, I think we're familiar with that. Post-delivery activities, no real change there from 2008. Control of changes, important as always to the quality profession. Release of our products and services, again, nothing terribly new there. And of course, control of non-conforming outputs. Now the context of Clause 8 is about immediate containment of things that go wrong. We'll look again at this in Clause 10, where we'll be looking at improvement. So in general, in the 9001 standard, I would suggest that Clause 8 is very detailed, and it does run to several pages in the standard. It's very clear, presented in a more business-like way, though having said it's very similar to 2008, I do think it's been softened, shall we say, to come across in a more business-like way. Sets out design as a process very well. It's in our quality management system comfort zone, I would suggest, and it is largely addressing the 2008 clauses 7, product realization, and 8.3, control of non-conforming product. And again, just to remind you, do keep questions coming in. I can see that we've already got some questions coming through, and we will be addressing those shortly. We move on now to Clause 9, performance evaluation. Evaluation is a new requirement or a new term in 9001-2015. It's already in use in ISO 14001-2004, I'm sure some of you listening are also familiar with and using this standard, so you've already come across this term. But it comes to us through Annex SL. And evaluation is about taking information and reaching a judgment. So evaluating whether or not something is acceptable in a particular context. So it's not necessarily, is it right or is it wrong, is it acceptable, is it not acceptable? It's judging, evaluating in a given set of circumstances. In this clause, we also have a requirement for internal audit, and no change there. For those of us who are familiar with the 2008 standard, perhaps a bit more in emphasis on remembering to include customer feedback, organizational changes and quality objectives in our internal audit. And certainly when we look at changes and objectives, I've already mentioned that these things are enhanced in the 2015 standard and hence need to be enhanced perhaps in our internal audit. Management review, there's no significant change from the 2008 requirement, and again this is a generic requirement in all management system standards. So looking at the generic Annex SL requirements and the equivalent 9001 requirements, we have a requirement to monitor, measure, analyse and evaluate. And we have those same requirements, not surprisingly, in 9001/2015. We see straight away, however, that the quality profession has introduced some further subheadings here. And in particular, that subheading 9.1.2, customer satisfaction, that is very much an additional requirement for 9001 because customers are important within the quality context. That does not appear in Annex SL and will not necessarily be present in other management system standards. There's a requirement for internal audit. No change, it just transmits across to 9001. And again, management review, there is the same requirement, not surprisingly, in 9001 with some subheadings, but I think these are really largely editorial, these subheadings. So what's specific in this clause 9 to 9001/2015? Well, customer satisfaction is specific to 9001. Evaluation of data and its use to improve the QMS is, not surprisingly, specific to 9001. And the additional requirements that are mentioned in management review to consider customer satisfaction, external providers and process performance, these are emphasized over and above Annex SL. What's changed from the 2008 standard? Well, there is this enhanced emphasis, as I've mentioned, on evaluation of results in addition to measurement and analysis. And monitoring should be based on risk, and I'll say a little bit more about risk in a moment because this is an important addition or enhancement to the 2015 standards. And when we look at customer feedback, customer perception, the 2015 standard now says this should include soliciting perceptions about the organization as well as its products and services. So not just how was our product, was it to your satisfaction, but how were we as an organization to deal with? You know, what do we like? So it's just getting that wider feedback, that wider perception from your customers. And the terms preventive action and statistical techniques are no longer mentioned, no longer referenced. So that's another change from the 2008 standard, and we'll come back to preventive action in a moment. And interestingly, there's no explicit requirement for a documented procedure for internal audit and management review. So let's just think about that for a moment. No explicit requirement for a documented procedure. However, you must do internal audit and management review, not surprisingly, and you must have documented information as evidence that you've carried out those activities. We tend to call those records. So still a requirement clearly to do them, but the need for a documented procedure is no longer explicitly stated. If you still wish to have those documented, then of course you must continue to do so. Moving now to clause 10, improvement, and this is where we pick up non-conformity and corrective action again, looking at trends and analysis of these things with a view to improvement. I would suggest in clause 10 the requirements are probably familiar and well understood by you already. What about preventive action? Doesn't appear. It doesn't appear in this clause. It doesn't appear anywhere in the 2015 standard, and it doesn't appear in Annex SL, because one of the objectives of an effective management system is in itself preventive action. So we now have an emphasis on the process approach and on risk-based thinking. Risk-based thinking is another way of expressing preventive action. So again, looking at the Annex SL requirements and the equivalent 9001 requirements, we straight away see that there's an additional sub-clause here, general. That general clause doesn't appear in Annex SL because 10.1 is non-conformity and corrective action, and we have that same generic requirement in 9001. Continual improvement, not surprisingly, carries over as a requirement in 9001. So, as we've already seen, there is an additional sub-clause, this general requirement, which is specific or unique to the 9001 standard. And this general requirement is emphasizing the importance of being proactive in seeking improvement. And this is the quality profession recognizing and enhancing the importance of improvement. So that's where 10.1 general, that's why we have that additional sub-clause. And this is a significant change from the 2008 standard. So a change that we see from 2008 to 2015 is this requirement for proactive, seeking proactive improvement, which can be a result of corrective action, innovation, or reorganization. So there are various ways that we can proactively improve. And as I mentioned, clearly we don't have any reference now to preventive action, and not surprisingly, there's no longer an explicit requirement for a documented preventive action procedure. So that's another documented procedure that is no longer a prescribed requirement. If you've got one and you're happy with it and it serves you well, by all means keep it. But the standards are not requiring it. So just looking more generally at changes in the standard, we overall, and I tried to emphasize this as I went through, that a lot of the changes are a change in emphasis or making things more explicit compared to the 2008 standard. So we've got some changes in emphasis and changes in terminology. So context is a new term. Process approach, risk-based thinking. These are in blue here because they're very important in 9001. Leadership planning, strategic direction, documented information. This is terminology. These are themes that come to us from Annex SL, and hence they're in black text here. Organizational knowledge, externally provided products and services. These are terms that are very important in the 9001 2015 standard. And we have here a little table of key changes in terminology. I'm not going to dwell on this because you will receive a copy of this presentation and you can study this at your leisure. Just to confuse you, I have 2008 on the left-hand side and the 2015 terminology on the right-hand side. But you'll notice straight away, looking down the right-hand side, there's a lot of terminology that we had in 2008 that no longer appears in the 2015 standard. I'd just like to spend the last couple of minutes homing in on some changes and emphasis enhancements that have come in 2015. That's process, risk, and organisational knowledge. So in the 2015 standard, there is a section 0. It's not an auditable section, but do read it. There's some very useful information in there, including this clause 0.3, the process approach. And it subdivides into general requirements. We have the plan, do, check, act cycle, this section, and those 10 clauses of Annex SL are all structured around plan, do, check, act. And then we have this risk-based thinking requirement. So what is the process approach? So it ensures understanding and consistently meeting requirements, consideration of processes in terms of added value. We need to consider effective process performance, and we need to improve our processes, and to do this we're going to need data and information, and we're going to need to evaluate that data and information. And we need to think about risk. You can't really separate process and risk. They're very closely entwined, but we need to consider risk. And we have here a very, very simple illustration of a process. So we have our requirements, our inputs to the process or processes. We have the various operations, the process itself. We have outputs from that, and those outputs may go through further processes to become products and services. And then we've just overlaid that with indications of risk, thinking about risk, the risk-based approach. There are various points in the process where there may be points of weakness. Have we thought about those weaknesses? Thinking about those weaknesses is applying risk-based thinking. Risk-based thinking has in fact been implicit in earlier versions of the standard. For example, the term preventive action is a risk-based approach, risk-based thinking. Planning and implementing actions to address risks and opportunities, that's very explicit in the 2015 standard. Risk is the effect of uncertainty, and uncertainty can be a positive as well as a negative. The standard in various places closely links process and risk. It explicitly links these in the 2015 standard. However, there are other references to risk, but it's not necessarily called risk. There's different terminology, different terms and phrases. For example, is appropriate to, and we suggest here the context, strategic direction. Ensuring something is appropriate to is one way of thinking about risk. Potential impact on the conformity of product. I suspect that's a phrase that's very familiar to you. That's risk. That's a risk-based approach. That's thinking about risk, potential impact. Objectives need to be relevant to the conformity of products. Again, that relevance is a way of thinking about risk. Potential consequences of failure. There's a very clear expression of thinking about risk. And ensuring there's no adverse impact on conformity. Another way of stating risk. Now, I know there's been some anxiety about the risk-based approach, and the 2015 standard does mention risk quite a lot, explicitly mentions risk. This particular table, the matrix that I have here, again, I'm not going to dwell on it. You can study this at your leisure when you receive the presentation, but I think it's very, very helpful in this respect. I can say that because it wasn't developed by me, it was developed by a colleague, but I do think it's extremely helpful in understanding the risk, the thinking about risk within the context of the standard. So we have the various management system topics and the related clause reference. But what I really want to draw your attention to in that top row on the right hand side is the terminology or the vocabulary that pops up throughout the standard. And these are all terms related to risk. So we've got the term risk itself, we've got the term complex or complexity, impact, effect, likelihood, consequence. These are all expressions of risk. So when we talk about risk-based thinking, we're already doing it. We were doing it in the 2008 standard. We were doing it long before the 2008 standard. It's just we didn't always use the term risk. Organizational knowledge, a very interesting clause unique to 9001/2015, well defined in this clause 7.1.6. Organizational knowledge is specific to the organization, can be gained by experience and used and shared to achieve objectives. There are internal sources of knowledge, external sources. And I find this an interesting one because there's a lot of knowledge resides within an organization, a lot of it perhaps in people's heads, a lot of it in managers' heads. A lot of it is perhaps not written down for good reason, but it's thinking, when you think about things like succession planning, that's actually about preserving organizational knowledge and making sure it is transferred where needed. I had a very interesting conversation this week, in fact, with a manager who was able to tell me in some detail what his various employees knew, who he would ask to do what and why. And when I said, have you written this down, he said no, because it's not the sort of information that should be written down, but clearly he was very much in control of that information because it was important to the business. Right. In summary, looking at 9001/2015, I think there are changes, and there are significant changes. The changes are reduced emphasis on documentation, no explicit requirement for a management rep, no explicit reference to preventive action, and we've got some new terminology. They're changes, we'll get used to them, we're already used to them. Significant changes, the things that we'll carry on talking about and needing to learn more about. There's the elevated focus on the process approach, the risk-based thinking, including opportunities, and Annex SL itself. These, I would suggest, are all significant changes. When I say here, what do I need to do? I mean, what do you need to do as clients of NQA? Details of what you need to do to transition to the new standard have been sent to you, and all certified companies will need to have transitioned by September 2018. So there's a 3-year window to fully transition. If you haven't received this information or haven't seen us, do get in touch with us, or indeed if you need any further help or information, do get in touch with us. And finally, I can look at questions and discussion points, but just to remind you, you will be sent a link to a recording of this webinar, and you will be sent the slides within 2 working days. So just looking at the questions that have come in. Can we receive a copy of the webinar? That query's come in from Peter Reddy, and yes, Peter, you will have access to a recording and copies of the slides. Any other questions? Yeah. Okay, right, so the only questions really that we're getting are around, can you have copies of this? And yes, the answer to that is definitely yes, and I do hope that you have found it helpful and will continue to find the copies of these presentations helpful. Another question that we've had is around the fact that the requirement for certain documented procedures is no longer in place, and as I've already indicated, if you wish to have these procedures documented and continue to have them documented, then by all means do so. The 2015 standard is a lot less prescriptive about documentation and the types of documents that you need, and in particular the 5 or 6 what we call prescriptive obligatory procedures. Those have gone. However, if you read through the standard carefully, there are something like 18 specific references to the need for documented information. A lot of that, I have to say, is what we would call records. So there's less emphasis now on documented procedures, but continuing emphasis on the importance of documented records as evidence. I've had a query here from Prunanth, I hope I've pronounced that correctly, asking, do we get participation certificates? I don't believe we do that. However, if you are thinking, as I suspect you are, that your participation in this would contribute to your CPD, and if you needed confirmation from us that you had participated in this webinar, we would be very happy to give you that information. So do get in touch with us if that in fact is your requirement. And Primnanth has just confirmed that I was indeed interpreting the question correctly. That's good. And that's a very important point that you raise, actually. We, both internally and externally, both for our own people and for our clients, are doing a lot of training, a lot of webinars, a lot of communication, a lot of sharing of knowledge, and it is all about our professional development. So again, anything that we are doing for you that is helping to contribute to your professional development, helping you to prepare for these standards, yes, if you need some confirmation from us, we'd be very happy to do that. There don't appear to be any more questions coming in, so can I just say a huge thank you to you all for joining this webinar. As I've emphasized, you do have the opportunity to listen to it again. We do appreciate you taking time out of your busy days, and in particular taking time out of your lunchtime for a lot of you, so that is very much appreciated. So thank you very much and goodbye.